I was driving through the Colorado mountains, snow piling up faster than the weather report had predicted. The winding roads were nearly invisible beneath a thick blanket of white. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road, waving frantically. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just a few feet away. It was a man, his clothes soaked through and his face pale with cold. I cracked the window. "Are you all right?" He rushed to my door, his eyes wide with panic. "My car slid off the road. Please, I need help." He pointed into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the falling snow. Every warning bell went off in my head. Something about his urgency felt wrong. "I'll call for help," I lied, knowing my phone was useless. His expression shifted, the desperation in his eyes replaced by something colder. He leaned closer, his hand on my door handle. "Please, let me in. I'm freezing." I glanced down and noticed his jacket wasn't dusted with snow. In fact, it was completely dry. He hadn't been out here long. I slammed the car into reverse, the wheels spinning before catching traction. His face twisted with rage as he yanked on the handle, but I hit the gas and sped away, his figure disappearing in my rearview mirror. I never found out who he was or where he came from. When I finally reached the town and reported it, the police searched but found no abandoned car and no footprints in the snow. Number 2. I thought a weekend getaway in a remote cabin in Montana would be the perfect way to relax. The snow was picturesque, and the isolation was just what I needed. The first night was peaceful, the silence of the woods wrapping around me like a blanket. The second night, I heard the knocking. It was faint at first, just a gentle tap, tap, tap on the cabin door. I assumed it was the wind, or maybe a tree branch, but then it came again, louder and more deliberate. I opened the door expecting to see a lost hiker or maybe a neighbor from another cabin, but there was no one there. Just a set of footprints leading away from the door and disappearing into the snow-covered woods. The next morning I followed the tracks, but they stopped suddenly, halfway down the path. It was as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That night, the knocking returned, more insistent this time. I yelled out, demanding to know who was there. Silence. Then a whisper through the door. "Let me in. It's so cold out here." I looked through the peephole, my heart freezing. A man stood on the other side, his face pressed against the door, his eyes wide and hollow. His clothes were thin, completely inadequate for the freezing temperatures. He was shivering violently, but his feet, they were hovering an inch above the snow. I stumbled back, heart racing. The knocking turned violent, the door rattling as if it was about to burst open. I backed away, locking myself in the bedroom, praying the door would hold. By morning, the knocking had stopped. I opened the door to find the footprints again, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the woods. But this time, there were no tracks leading to my door. I left that cabin without looking back. Number 3. My friends and I were driving through Wyoming, heading to a ski resort for the weekend. The snowstorm hit out of nowhere, turning the roads into a slick, icy mess. We were crawling along when we saw him, a man trudging through the snow, his thumb out, shivering violently. He looked desperate, frost clinging to his beard and his coat torn in several places. My buddy in the passenger seat rolled down his window. "Need a lift?" The man's face broke into a grateful smile. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would stop." He climbed in, his body shaking so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. We cranked up the heat as he introduced himself. Said his name was Danny and his car had broken down miles back. He spoke in short bursts, catching his breath between sentences. His hands were red and raw from the cold. As we drove, I asked him where he was headed. He hesitated before mumbling, "Just trying to get home." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and his smile was strained, like he was forcing it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. We passed a sign for a town up ahead, and he suddenly leaned forward. "No, not there. Keep going," he insisted, his voice sharp. The car fell silent. My friends exchanged nervous glances. "All right. No problem," I said, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. Minutes later, we passed another sign, and Danny shifted uneasily. "I need to get out," he muttered. Before we could respond, he opened the door and jumped out, disappearing into the snowstorm. I slammed on the brakes, but by the time we stopped, he was gone. No footprints, no sign of him at all. We reported the incident when we reached the next town. The local sheriff went pale when we described Danny. He pulled out an old newspaper article. The photo was unmistakable. It was Danny. He had died in a car accident on that very stretch of road 15 years ago.